So here's a question for you. When we pick up a major biography, one about a figure like John F. Kennedy, are we actually looking for historical truth?
Or is it something else?
Right. Or are we maybe just seeking a polished confirmation of the myth we already hold in our heads? That question really defines how we approach a huge book like this one.
It's the essential starting point. And today, we're going far beyond a simple summary. We're undertaking a full, comprehensive critique of Fredrik Logevall's JFK, Coming of Age in the American Century, 1917-1956.
It's an intelligent book, no doubt about that, deeply researched.
Oh, absolutely. But we believe some books just have to be challenged, especially when their critique of power feels, well, incomplete.
Exactly. Our mission here is to really test its arguments, and we're using a systematic approach for this. This critique uses a step-by-step critical thinking framework where we map claims to evidence.
We're also applying an intellectual framework from the works of Mortimer J. Adler and using tools like the Golden Rule and the U.S. Preamble to look for ethical asymmetries.
And then we'll wrap up with a logical analysis to reach a balanced conclusion.
And just so you know, you are experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation powered by Google's Notebook LM. We're using it to get deeper into this book for a more dynamic critique.
Okay, so let's start with the book's greatest virtue, because it is substantial. I mean, the sheer depth of the research.
It's immense. Logevall clearly spent years digging through archives. He's using newly available material, private letters, things that give us a much fuller picture.
He really reconstructs Kennedy's education, his travels, and especially his wartime service in really unprecedented detail.
And what's so interesting about that is how it successfully rehabilitates JFK's intellectual seriousness.
That's a great point.
If you came to this book thinking Kennedy was just some pampered playboy who coasted on charm, you have to completely adjust your perspective. The book is fantastic at showing his early independence.
Especially from his father, Joe Kennedy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That distinction is key. Joe Kennedy was, deeply entrenched in isolationism and appeasement in the late 1930s.
A completely different worldview.
And Logevall makes it crystal clear that Jack's anti-fascism, his internationalism, that was intellectually grounded, it wasn't just him being opportunistic or rebelling against his dad.
He was actually reading, traveling, thinking for himself.
Yes, actively analyzing the collapse of the pre-war order. That detail grounds him as a thinker in a way previous biographies maybe haven't.
I was also really struck by the structural frame Logevall uses. It's really quite brilliant. He doesn't just trace one life.
No, he runs a parallel story.
The story of the United States itself, rising to global power. The whole idea of the American century.
And that parallel story covers everything. The debate over isolationism before the war, the impact of World War II, the early Cold War, McCarthyism.
Even the rise of television as a political force.
Right, and that massive frame is what makes the biography work. It makes Kennedy feel less like this isolated great man and more like a product of his historical moment.
Someone wrestling with the same huge forces that were shaping the entire world.
And that context is perfect for setting the stage for his presidency. It helps explain why his international sensibility became so important.
That skepticism he had towards the military brass, for instance.
Exactly, and his instinct for negotiation. It all mattered so much later on in the nuclear age when he's handling crises like the Cuban Missile Crisis. This book gives you the essential prehistory for that temperament.
It shows him learning not just about American power, but also about its very devastating limits.
Okay, but let's pivot a bit. The book isn't just about politics, it's about the man. And Logevall is, I think, very successful at demystifying that whole sugary Camelot myth.
He does it without turning the book into just a takedown piece, which is a fine line to walk.
It is. He steps beyond that tired old binary, the flame keepers versus the debunkers. He paints JFK as this really curious, self-directed person.
Someone who sought out people who would challenge his thinking.
Yes. So you get a figure who is both more intellectually serious and, importantly, more flawed. He details the chronic health problems, the immense privilege, and that undeniable sense of entitlement.
It's humanizing, which is a real strength.
Right.
But, and this is where we need to apply that critical filter, even sympathetic reviewers noted that the narrative can feel a bit romanticized.
Especially in how it describes his charisma and charm.
Right. And that's a subtle but really vital distinction. An author has to report on the chart, of course, because it was a real historical factor in his rise.
But the emotional center of the book often focuses on the emergence of this gifted cosmopolitan leader. When you focus too much on the gifts, it subtly recenters the story around admiration.
Instead of maintaining that critical distance.
Right. Critical distance on how class and money and male privilege really guaranteed his ascent almost regardless of those gifts.
I think that's right. When you're describing someone as irresistible, even implicitly, it's hard to maintain an objective lens on the system that elevated him.
This need for reflection, for rational thought when you're faced with such a compelling story, that's something we explore all the time.
And we make these kinds of critical points available through Mindful Moments. That's our YouTube channel, offering AI, book analysis, summaries, critiques, and podcasts to inspire rational thought on figures just like Kennedy.
Which is crucial because the structural critiques of this book are just as important as the character ones. For instance, the book is undeniably lengthy. It's huge.
Nearly 1,000 pages. And for some readers, it can feel slow. The detail on his schooling, his early writings, his wartime episodes, it can feel exhaustive.
Exhaustive without always being analytical enough.
And there's that stylistic issue a lot of critics brought up, the constant use of speculative phrases.
Oh, yes. The one wonders if Kennedy felt, or one detects a sense of...
Instead of just committing to an argument based on the evidence, he sometimes hedges.
And those phrases, repeated over and over, they subtly dilute his authority as a historian. It positions him more as a fellow observer, wondering about JFK, rather than as the expert drawing sharp conclusions.
That definitely softens the book's analytical punch.
And then, well, there's the elephant in the room, the choice to stop in 1956.
It's a massive structural choice for a political biography. I mean, he enters the White House just 4 years later.
It is a massive choice, because it means the most politically revealing and ethically complicated episodes are all deferred.
The Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the serious civil rights confrontations, the start of the Vietnam escalation.
All of it is pushed to later volumes, and that decision to stop in 1956 makes us, the readers, much more forgiving.
We're left looking at the promise, the potential of the man. It naturally tilts the whole interpretation towards sympathy and hope.
Right, rather than toward the hard, messy tests of power and responsibility that actually defined his presidency.
Which brings us squarely to the systematic critique of power and privilege. Logevall does acknowledge the Kennedys' immense wealth and influence.
He has to. It's essential context. But I was just stunned by that quote where JFK admits he did not learn about the Depression until he read about it at Harvard.
That detail is incredible. It puts him in a completely different universe from the people he would eventually lead.
It does. And the critique the book doesn't fully press is, what does it mean for a democracy that a figure so insulated from deprivation could rise so easily through family money and elite networks?
The book notes the double standard of his starting point, but it doesn't really challenge the deeper implications for American meritocracy.
And if we expand that analysis, we have to look at how gender issues are marginalized.
The biography does address his dalliances, his sexual conduct. It has to.
But they remain secondary. They're sort of a sidebar to the main political and intellectual story.
And from a standpoint that centers equality, that's a huge missed opportunity. The relative marginalization of that gendered power, the objectification, the real impact on the women in his life.
It's treated more like a colorful footnote to a great man's story rather than looking at the actual political cost of that behavior.
Finally, let's talk about the context of American global power.
Logevall paints a really compelling picture of JFK's wartime, unvarnished realism. His skepticism of military hierarchy, his awareness of the human cost of war. He's sketched as a cautious leader.
Someone who believed in American leadership but was wary of purely military solutions.
Absolutely. That internal wariness is crucial. But critics argue the book is less explicit about the larger system of American global dominance he was a part of.
He inherited it and he led it.
And Logevall shows Kennedy being cautious within that system, but he's less analytical about how even a cautious leader is still embedded in the structural reality of American imperial power. That deeper analysis feels a bit light.
So when we put it all together, what's our final takeaway?
Well, Logevall's book delivers an incredible amount of high-quality factual detail. That's the information. His health, his education, his family, his early political career, all set against this rich backdrop of mid-century America.
And the deeper understanding it offers is that Kennedy's early years were this brilliant fusion of elite privilege with genuine intellectual curiosity and that hard-won wartime realism.
It produced a leader who was, yes, unusually sensitive to the dangers of great power conflict, but still deeply invested in American primacy.
Now, this rigorous assessment we've done was constructed using recognized systematic methods for evaluating nonfiction work, ensuring precision in mapping claims to data, and identifying the moral coherence in the author's argument.
Which leaves the final critical question to you, the listener. Can a figure so deeply entrenched in the blind spots of his class, his gender, and his national position ever be fully and justly evaluated as a great man within an egalitarian moral framework?
That is the essential complexity that Logevall's work forces us all to confront.
Even if the book itself sometimes struggles to fully critique it.
Click the link on screen for the in-depth book analysis. Subscribe, share, purchase via link, and think rationally.
See the many genre-based book podcasts at Mindful Moments. Subscribe and nourish your mind on the go.